Something fundamental has shifted in the global power structure, and most Americans are only catching pieces of it through the noise of daily headlines. Russia, the country that spent years projecting military dominance across the Middle East, is now watching two of its most critical strategic pillars, Syria and Iran, crumble beneath its feet at the same time. And the timing of all this is not accidental. This is not a coincidence of history. What we are witnessing right now is a slow, deliberate, and calculated erosion of Russian influence in regions where Moscow spent decades and billions of dollars building leverage. The real question that nobody in mainstream media is asking loudly enough is this: did Washington engineer this? And if so, what does it mean for the future of American power, Russian ambition, and the balance of the entire global order going forward? So let's talk about what's actually happening here, because I think a lot of people are missing the full picture. Russia is getting squeezed, not just in Ukraine, not just in one corner of the world, but simultaneously in Syria and in Iran. And the question everyone should be asking is whether this is coincidence or whether this is something far more deliberate and far more strategic than the mainstream media is giving Washington credit for. And I want to walk you through this carefully, because when you start connecting the dots, the picture that emerges is genuinely staggering. Let's start with Syria, because Syria is where the story really begins to crystallize. For years, and I mean years, Russia's military presence in Syria was considered one of the most significant geopolitical achievements of the Putin era. Think about what Russia actually built there. They had the Hmeimim Air Base in Latakia, a fully operational military installation on the Mediterranean coast, giving Russia its first real warm water military foothold in decades. They had Tartus, the naval facility, which was Russia's only naval base outside of the former Soviet Union. These weren't small outposts. These were strategic assets that Russia had invested enormous resources in defending, maintaining, and expanding. Putin had essentially bet a significant portion of Russia's global military credibility on the idea that Assad would survive, that Russia's intervention would be decisive, and that Moscow would emerge from the Syrian conflict with its influence in the Middle East cemented for a generation. And for a while, that bet looked like it was paying off. Assad stayed in power. Russia's air campaign turned the tide of the civil war. Moscow was invited to diplomatic tables it had previously been excluded from. The Gulf states, Turkey, Israel, everyone was calling Moscow. Everyone was negotiating with Moscow because Russia had made itself indispensable to any conversation about Syria's future. Putin was walking tall. He had taken a situation that looked like a potential catastrophe, a collapsing allied government, and turned it into a demonstration of Russian military and diplomatic power. That was the narrative, and for several years that narrative held. But then something shifted, and what shifted wasn't just the military situation on the ground. What shifted was the broader architecture of alliances and pressures surrounding Assad's government. The rebel forces that ultimately moved against Damascus were not the disorganized, fractured opposition that Russia had been fighting for years. These were disciplined, coordinated, and this is the part that people need to sit with for a moment, they were operating in a way that suggested serious external support and serious external coordination. When Aleppo fell, when city after city fell in rapid succession, it wasn't the kind of chaotic collapse you see when a regime simply runs out of steam. It was surgical, it was fast, and it left Russia completely flat-footed. Now, Russia couldn't respond the way it had in the past. And here is where you have to understand the broader context. Russia's military is deeply committed in Ukraine. The resources, the manpower, the ammunition, the equipment, it's all being fed into that conflict at a rate that leaves very little margin for simultaneous operations elsewhere. Putin couldn't just pivot and pour more air power into Syria the way he did in 2015. The Russian military machine as formidable as it is on paper, was stretched. And Assad's enemies knew that. Whoever was coordinating the timing of this offensive, and I'm not going to pretend we know every actor in that room, they understood that this was the moment. Russia was distracted. Russia was depleted in critical ways, and Assad was exposed. When Assad fell, Russia didn't just lose an ally. Russia lost those bases. It lost Hmeimim. It lost Tartus. Decades of investment, of diplomatic capital, of military presence on the Mediterranean, gone. And the new authorities in Syria made very clear very quickly that Russia's continued presence was not something they were interested in accommodating. Now, you can debate whether those negotiations might eventually produce some arrangement, but the baseline reality is that Russia went from having a secure, prestigious military foothold in the Middle East to scrambling for any kind of deal that lets them save face. That is a humiliation of the first order, and it happened while the entire world was watching. But here's what I want you to think about alongside Syria, because the Syria story doesn't exist in isolation. At the very same time that Russia was losing its footing in Damascus, something was happening with Iran that deserves equal attention. Iran is Russia's most important regional partner, not just strategically, economically, militarily. Iran has been supplying Russia with Shahed drones that have been absolutely central to Russia's campaign in Ukraine. This is not a peripheral relationship. This is a core supply chain for Russia's war effort. And Iran's ability to maintain that relationship, to keep that pipeline of military hardware flowing, depends on Iran's own stability and Iran's own strategic position. Now, think about what has happened to Iran over the past year or so. Israel has conducted some of the most audacious military strikes against Iran that anyone would have predicted just a few years ago. The strikes on Iranian air defense systems, which, by the way, exposed just how penetrable Iran's defenses actually are, were a message. And that message wasn't just for Tehran. That message was for Moscow too. Because when Israel demonstrates that it can reach inside Iran, that it can degrade Iran's capabilities, that it can operate in Iranian airspace without being shot down, it is simultaneously demonstrating that the Iran-Russia military partnership has vulnerabilities that external actors can exploit. And here is where the American dimension becomes impossible to ignore. Israel does not conduct operations of this scale, this sophistication, this geopolitical sensitivity without some degree of coordination with Washington. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's just the reality of how the US-Israel relationship works on matters of regional security. The level of intelligence sharing, the diplomatic cover, the resupply arrangements, none of that happens in a vacuum. So when Israel was hitting Iranian targets, degrading Iranian capabilities, and exposing the limits of Russian-supplied air defense systems, because some of those systems were Russian and they didn't perform, Washington was in that picture somewhere, not necessarily directing every move, but certainly aware, certainly coordinating on the broader strategic logic. And that broader strategic logic, when you step back and look at it, is actually quite coherent. If your goal is to weaken Russia, not just in Ukraine, but globally, structurally, then you want to attack Russia's support system. You want to make it harder for Russia to sustain its war effort, harder for Russia to maintain its global prestige, harder for Russia to present itself as a reliable partner to anyone in the world. And the most efficient way to do that, rather than simply pouring more weapons into Ukraine, is to go after the nodes. Syria was a node. Iran is a node. And both of them are under enormous pressure simultaneously. Now, let's talk about Putin's position, because I think there's a tendency in some circles to still view Putin as this master strategist who is always 3 moves ahead. And I want to push back on that a little, not because Putin isn't intelligent or capable, but because the evidence of the last couple of years suggests that he has made some serious miscalculations and those miscalculations are now compounding on each other in ways that are genuinely difficult to recover from. The original invasion of Ukraine was supposed to be quick. Everyone knows that now. The plan was a rapid decapitation of the Ukrainian government, a swift installation of a friendly administration, and a fait accompli that the West would grumble about, but ultimately accept the way it accepted Crimea in 2014. That didn't happen. What happened instead was a prolonged grinding conflict that has consumed Russian resources, Russian manpower, Russian equipment, and, perhaps most importantly, Russian credibility on the world stage. The image of Russian military invincibility, which was central to Putin's whole strategic posture, has been significantly damaged, not destroyed. Russia is still a nuclear power, still a major force, but damaged in ways that matter. And because that conflict has dragged on, Russia has had to make choices it didn't want to make. It has had to become genuinely dependent on Iran for military supplies in a way that reversed the traditional power dynamic. Russia used to be the senior partner in that relationship, the supplier, the patron. Now Russia is the customer. It has had to lean on North Korea for artillery shells, which is not exactly a relationship that projects strength. It has had to accept a situation in which China holds enormous leverage over Russia's economic survival because Western sanctions have pushed Russia into Beijing's arms in a way that is not entirely comfortable for Moscow. Putin went into Ukraine thinking he was going to demonstrate Russian power and reassert Russia's sphere of influence. What he has actually done is create a situation in which Russia is more dependent, more isolated, and more vulnerable than it has been in decades. And now, on top of all of that, he is watching his positions in Syria and Iran deteriorate simultaneously. This is what strategists call strategic overextension. You commit to more fronts, more obligations, more relationships than you can actually sustain when things go wrong. And things have gone wrong. The question now is what Putin can actually do about it. And the honest answer is that his options are quite limited. He can't significantly reinforce Syria without pulling resources from Ukraine, and pulling resources from Ukraine risks exactly the kind of collapse on the Eastern Front that would be domestically catastrophic. He can't dramatically increase support for Iran without drawing the kind of direct confrontation with Israel and potentially the United States that he has, to his credit, carefully avoided throughout this conflict. He is in a box. And the people who built that box, whether you credit Washington directly or the broader coalition of Western and regional actors that Washington has been assembling and coordinating, deserve more analytical credit than they typically receive. Because the American strategy here, and let's be honest, this is more Biden's architecture than it is Trump's, though Trump is now inheriting it, has been more sophisticated than its critics give it credit for. The surface level criticism is that the US has been weak, reactive, slow, that it took too long to send weapons to Ukraine, that it imposed too many restrictions on how those weapons could be used, that it was too cautious, too hesitant. And some of that criticism is fair. But underneath all of that, there has been a consistent strategic logic, which is to impose costs on Russia across multiple dimensions without triggering a direct NATO-Russia conflict. To weaken Russia economically through sanctions, to weaken Russia militarily by sustaining Ukrainian resistance, to weaken Russia strategically by going after its partnerships and its global positioning. And when you add Syria and Iran to that equation, the picture of accumulated pressure on Moscow becomes genuinely significant. Russia has lost or is losing its Mediterranean base access. Russia's most important drone supplier is being systematically degraded by Israeli strikes that Washington is tacitly enabling. Russia's global reputation as a military power has been tarnished by the performance of its equipment in Ukraine and by the exposure of its client states' vulnerabilities. These are not small things. These are structural setbacks that will shape Russia's strategic position for years, possibly decades. Now, I want to be careful here because I don't want to overstate the case. Russia is not collapsing. Putin is not about to fall. The Russian economy has proven more resilient than many Western analysts predicted in the early days of sanctions. Russia still controls significant territory in Ukraine and is still conducting military operations. The idea that Russia is somehow finished, defeated, or about to be brought to its knees is not supported by the evidence. What is supported by the evidence is that Russia is significantly weaker than it was 3 years ago, that its strategic options are significantly narrower, and that the arc of the conflict, when you look at all the fronts simultaneously, is bending against Moscow. And what that means for the question in our title, is America now dominating Putin, is complicated. Dominating is probably too strong a word if what you mean is that America has achieved decisive victory or that Putin has been humiliated into submission. But if what you mean is that Washington has successfully maneuvered Russia into a position of strategic disadvantage across multiple theaters simultaneously, then yes, there is a real argument to be made that American strategy, for all its visible fumbles and public contradictions, has been more effective than it appears on the surface. Think about what Washington has actually achieved. It has kept NATO unified in a way that many people, including Putin himself, probably didn't expect. Remember, the conventional wisdom before February 2022 was that NATO was brain dead, that European countries were too dependent on Russian energy to maintain meaningful solidarity, that the alliance would fracture under pressure. None of that happened. NATO is larger than it was before the invasion. Finland and Sweden joined, which is a massive strategic setback for Moscow, given the length of the new NATO-Russia border. European countries have dramatically increased their defense spending. The European Union has found a kind of strategic purpose it had been struggling to articulate for years. At the same time, Washington has enabled, directly or indirectly, the series of events that have dislodged Russia from Syria and degraded Iran's capacity to support Russia's war machine. And it has done all of this while avoiding direct military confrontation with a nuclear power, which is genuinely the hardest part of the whole equation. Managing escalation with Russia, keeping the pressure on without triggering the kind of desperate response that a cornered nuclear power might contemplate, requires extraordinary care. And whatever you think of the overall strategy, the fact that we have not seen direct NATO-Russia military engagement 2+ years into this conflict is itself a significant achievement. But let me bring this back to the ground level for a moment, because it's easy to get lost in grand strategic abstractions and forget that everything we're talking about involves real places, real people, and real consequences that extend far beyond the chess match between Washington and Moscow. Syria is a country that has been devastated, millions of people displaced, cities destroyed, an entire generation traumatized. The fall of Assad is not simply a geopolitical win to be tallied on some strategic scoreboard. It is the outcome of a catastrophic civil war that has cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Whatever comes next in Syria is uncertain and potentially very dangerous for the Syrian people, regardless of what it means for Russian base access. Similarly, Iran, the pressure on Iran, the Israeli strikes, the broader economic strangulation through sanctions. These have real effects on real Iranian citizens who are themselves living under a repressive government that they did not necessarily choose and that many of them actively resist. When we talk about degrading Iran's capabilities, we have to remember that the people absorbing the consequences of that pressure are not simply chess pieces in a geopolitical game. They are human beings navigating an extraordinarily difficult situation. And Russia. The Russian people are living through something genuinely painful: economic hardship, the loss of tens of thousands of young men in Ukraine, a degree of international isolation that has real cultural and economic consequences. Putin's miscalculations have not just hurt Russia's geopolitical position, they have hurt Russian people in ways that will take a long time to fully reckon with. I raise all of this not to undermine the strategic analysis, but to insist that the strategic analysis be conducted with clear eyes about what it actually costs. Because one of the failures of a lot of geopolitical commentary is that it becomes so absorbed in the game, in who's winning, who's losing, who's outmaneuvering whom, that it loses sight of the human reality underneath. And when the human reality is this large, this consequential, that loss of sight is a serious moral failure. Having said that, the strategic question remains important because the strategic outcomes will shape the conditions in which people live for decades to come. A Russia that has been successfully contained and deterred, that has been taught through accumulated costs that military aggression against neighboring countries leads to strategic disaster, is ultimately better for the people of Ukraine, better for the people of Europe, and arguably better for Russia itself in the long run, even if the short-term pain is enormous. A Russia that successfully consolidates its gains in Ukraine and walks away from this conflict with its expansionist ambitions validated would be a far more dangerous Russia, one that would eventually threaten stability across a much wider geography. So when we ask whether America is dominating Putin, the more precise and more useful question is probably this: has Washington succeeded in making Russian aggression strategically costly enough that the overall arc of the conflict bends toward a more stable and just outcome? And when you look at Syria, when you look at Iran, when you look at NATO expansion, when you look at the sustained Ukrainian resistance, when you look at Russia's growing dependence on junior partners like Iran and North Korea, the answer, tentatively, carefully, with all the appropriate uncertainty, is that the pressure is working, not perfectly, not without enormous cost, not without serious moral complications, but working in the structural sense that matters most for long-term stability. Putin walked into this expecting a quick victory and a new world order with Russia reasserted as a great power. What he has gotten instead is a grinding war, a shrinking network of capable allies, a military reputation that has taken serious damage, and a strategic position in the Middle East that has deteriorated dramatically. That is not domination in the Hollywood sense, but in the real, slow, grinding world of great power competition, it is something close to strategic success for Washington, and the story is not over yet.